Daniel sat frozen in his seat, staring at the red marks all over his test paper. Another F, the third one this month. Around him, his classmates were buzzing with excitement, comparing scores and celebrating their A's and B's. But Daniel just wanted to disappear into his chair and become invisible. Class dismissed, Mr. Thompson announced, and everyone rushed out to lunch. Daniel waited until the room was nearly empty before stuffing the failed test into his backpack. He knew what was coming next. The disappointed look from his parents. The lecture about trying harder. The same conversation they'd had 100 times before. Walking through the hallway felt like walking through a minefield. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to talk about grades or college applications. In his junior year of high school, it seemed like that was all anyone wanted to talk about. "Hey Daniel, what did you get on the chemistry test?" Someone called out behind him. He pretended not to hear and walked faster. The cafeteria was loud and crowded as usual. Daniel found his usual spot in the corner, away from the popular kids and the honor students. He pulled out his sandwich and tried to eat, but his stomach was in knots. How was he going to explain another failing grade to his parents? His phone buzzed. A text from his mom asking how his test went. Daniel turned off his phone and shoved it in his pocket. He couldn't deal with that conversation right now. The truth was, Daniel had studied for that chemistry test. He'd spent 3 hours the night before trying to memorize formulas and equations. But when he sat down to take the test, all the information just seemed to scramble in his head. The letters and numbers swam around on the page, refusing to make sense. It was like trying to read underwater. This wasn't new. It had been happening his entire life. Elementary school had been a nightmare of reading groups where he stumbled over words that other kids found easy. Middle school brought math problems that seemed impossible to solve, even when teachers explained them 3 or 4 times. And now high school was turning into a daily reminder that he just wasn't cut out for academic success. The worst part wasn't even the failing grades. It was the way people looked at him. Like he was lazy. Like he wasn't trying hard enough. Like he just didn't care about his future. If only they knew the truth. Every night after school, while his classmates went to sports practice or hung out with friends, Daniel walked to the convenience store 3 blocks from his house. He'd been working there since he turned 16, taking the evening shift from 5 to midnight. The money wasn't great, but his family needed it. His parents had come to this country 8 years ago with big dreams and empty pockets. His father worked 2 jobs and his mother cleaned houses during the day. They tried their best, but money was always tight. The rent was always due, the bills kept piling up, and there never seemed to be enough to cover everything. So Daniel worked. He stocked shelves, ran the cash register, and mopped floors until closing time. Then he'd walk home after midnight, try to do his homework with exhausted eyes, and maybe get 4 or 5 hours of sleep before starting all over again. Nobody at school knew about his job. Nobody knew that he sometimes went to class on an empty stomach because there wasn't enough breakfast to go around at home. Nobody knew that he couldn't afford a tutor or a calculator or the study guides that other students used. All they saw was the kid who came last in almost every class. The student who barely scraped by with D's and F's. The one teachers had stopped calling on because they knew he probably didn't know the answer. Daniel had started to believe it himself. Maybe he really was just not smart enough. Maybe some people were meant for college and careers and others were meant for minimum wage jobs. Maybe this was just who he was and he needed to accept it. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Daniel threw away his half-eaten sandwich and headed to his next class. English literature, another subject where he struggled to keep up. He took his usual seat in the back corner and opened his worn textbook. The class was discussing a novel they were supposed to have read over the weekend. Daniel had tried to read it, he really had. But after working his shift and dealing with a particularly difficult customer who'd yelled at him for 20 minutes about cigarette prices, he'd been too exhausted to focus on the tiny print swimming before his eyes. "Daniel, what did you think about the main character's decision in Chapter 7? Mrs. Patterson asked, catching him off guard. His face flushed hot. Everyone turned to look at him. He hadn't made it to Chapter 7. I'm not sure, he mumbled, sinking lower in his seat. Mrs. Patterson sighed and called on another student who gave a brilliant answer that made the whole class nod in agreement. Daniel felt smaller than ever. After class, he lingered behind, slowly packing his bag. He overheard 2 girls talking near the door. I don't understand why he's even still here, one of them said. He's going to fail out anyway. I know, right? My mom says some people just aren't college material. Their words hit him like a punch to the gut, even though he'd heard similar things before. He waited until they left before walking out, his shoulders hunched, carrying the weight of everyone's low expectations on his back. That evening at the convenience store, Daniel went through the motions mechanically. Scan items, take money, give change, smile at customers even when they were rude. His mind was elsewhere, spinning in circles about his future. What was going to happen to him? Would he work minimum wage jobs forever? Would he ever amount to anything? Was everyone right about him? As he restocked the candy aisle around 10 p.m., Daniel noticed an older man struggling with the self-checkout machine. Without thinking, he walked over to help. These machines are smarter than me, the man joked, stepping aside. Daniel smiled and quickly fixed the problem, explaining what had gone wrong in simple terms the man could understand. You're good at that, the man said, explaining things so they make sense. That's a real skill, you know. It was a small compliment probably forgotten by the man 5 minutes later, but for Daniel, working his night shift and wondering if he had any talents at all, those words were a tiny spark of light in a very dark time. He didn't know it yet, but his story was far from over. Sometimes the people who struggle the most at the beginning have the furthest to climb and the most amazing views waiting at the top. Daniel's senior year started the same way junior year had ended. Struggling grades, disappointed teachers, and the constant feeling that he was drowning while everyone else seemed to swim just fine. He'd almost gotten used to being the student who came last in everything. But then Ms. Rivera arrived. She was the new science teacher, replacing Mr. Thompson, who'd retired over the summer. Young, energetic, and way too enthusiastic for 8 in the morning, she bounced into the classroom on the first day with a huge smile and an unusual teaching style. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ms. Rivera, and I hate boring lectures just as much as you do, she announced. So we're going to do things differently in this class. Daniel sat in his usual spot in the back, barely paying attention. He'd heard teachers say stuff like this before. They always started excited and ended up disappointed in him, but Ms. Rivera was different. Instead of just writing on the board and expecting everyone to memorize facts, she brought in materials for hands-on experiments. She divided the class into groups and had them build models, create presentations, and explain concepts to each other. In the 3rd week of school, they had to build a simple machine using everyday materials. Daniel's group got the assignment to create a lever system that could lift a textbook. While his group members argued about the design and flipped through the textbook for formulas, Daniel just started building. His hands seemed to know what to do, even if he couldn't explain the physics behind it. Within 20 minutes, he'd constructed a working lever system using rulers, a pencil, and some tape. How did you do that so fast? One of his group members asked, amazed. Daniel shrugged. I don't know. It just made sense. Ms. Rivera came over to check their progress, and her eyes widened when she saw Daniel's creation. This is excellent work. Can you explain to the class how it functions? Daniel's stomach dropped. Explaining things in front of everyone was his nightmare. But Ms. Rivera had this way of looking at him that wasn't disappointed or skeptical. She actually seemed interested in what he had to say. He stood up, his voice shaky at first, and explained how the lever worked. He didn't use the fancy technical terms from the book, but he described it in a way that made sense. He talked about balance points and weight distribution like he was telling a story. When he finished, the class was quiet. Then Ms. Rivera started clapping. That was one of the clearest explanations of lever mechanics I've ever heard, she said. You have a gift for making complex ideas simple. Daniel sat down, his face burning. But for once, it wasn't from embarrassment. Nobody had ever called anything he did a gift before. After class, Ms. Rivera asked him to stay behind for a moment. Daniel's heart sank. Here it came. The lecture about his failing grades in other classes, about applying himself more, about reaching his potential. But that's not what happened. Daniel, I've been reviewing your file, she said gently, sitting on the edge of her desk. You struggle with written tests, but you excel at hands-on work and verbal explanations. Have you ever been tested for learning differences? Learning differences? Daniel repeated, confused. Like dyslexia or other conditions that can make traditional schoolwork difficult even though you're clearly intelligent. Nobody had ever called him intelligent before. The word felt strange and unfamiliar, like clothes that didn't quite fit. I'm not intelligent, he said quietly. I'm just bad at school. Ms. Rivera shook her head firmly. There's a difference between intelligence and how well you take written tests. I think you might have dyslexia. It would explain why you struggle with reading and written exams but can solve problems brilliantly when you work with your hands. Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest, a tiny seed of hope mixed with fear. Even if that's true, what difference does it make? He asked. I'm still going to fail. It makes all the difference, she insisted. Because once you know what you're dealing with, you can learn strategies to work with your brain instead of against it. She handed him some papers with information about getting tested through the school counselor. Daniel took them, not sure if he believed any of this could help, but willing to try anything at this point. The testing process took 3 weeks. Daniel met with the school psychologist twice, took a bunch of weird tests that involved reading passages, identifying patterns, and answering questions in different ways. The whole time he felt like he was being examined under a microscope. When the results came back, the psychologist called him and his parents in for a meeting. His mother had to take time off from cleaning houses, which made Daniel feel guilty. She couldn't afford to lose those hours. Daniel has moderate to severe dyslexia, the psychologist explained, showing them charts and test scores that Daniel couldn't really follow. This means his brain processes written information differently. Letters and words can appear jumbled or reversed. It's not a matter of intelligence or effort. His brain is just wired differently. His mother looked confused, struggling with some of the English words Daniel translated for her in their native language. And he saw her expression change from confusion to understanding to something that looked like relief. So he's not stupid? She asked in broken English, her voice thick with emotion. Not at all, the psychologist assured her. In fact, people with dyslexia often have exceptional problem-solving skills and creative thinking abilities. They just need different learning strategies. Daniel sat there trying to process this information. His whole life he'd believed he was just not smart enough. Every failed test, every frustrated teacher, every disappointed look from his parents had confirmed what he thought he knew about himself. But now someone was telling him it wasn't about intelligence at all. It was like finding out he'd been trying to run a race with his shoes tied together. Not because he was slow, but because he'd been set up to struggle from the start. The feelings were complicated. Relief that there was a reason, a name for what he'd been experiencing. Anger that nobody had caught this earlier, that he'd spent years thinking he was just dumb. Sadness for all the time he'd wasted believing he couldn't do anything right. But underneath all of that was something else. Something small but growing. Hope Ms. Rivera became his advocate after that. She helped him get accommodations, extra time on tests, and access to audiobooks instead of printed texts. She taught him techniques like using colored overlays on pages to reduce the visual stress of reading, and breaking down information into smaller chunks. More importantly, she helped him see that there were many different kinds of intelligence. That struggling with traditional schoolwork didn't make him less capable or valuable. Some of the most successful people in the world have dyslexia, she told him one day. Entrepreneurs, inventors, artists. They succeeded not despite their dyslexia, but sometimes because of it. It taught them to think differently, to find creative solutions, to persist when things got hard. Daniel started to look at himself differently, not as the student who came last, but as someone whose brain worked in a unique way, someone who had skills that others didn't, someone who'd survived years of struggle and was still standing. His grades didn't magically improve overnight. Dyslexia didn't disappear just because it had a name now, but he had tools to work with it, strategies that helped, and most importantly, he had someone who believed in him. For the first time in his academic life, Daniel started to believe in himself too. One evening at the convenience store, he helped a customer fix their phone. They'd been struggling with it for 20 minutes, getting more and more frustrated. Daniel looked at it for 30 seconds, pressed a few buttons, and handed it back working perfectly. How did you know how to do that? The customer asked, amazed. Daniel smiled. I guess my brain just works well with this kind of stuff. As he said it, he realized he meant it. His brain did work well with certain things. Not textbooks and essays, maybe, but problems he could see and touch and solve with his hands. Technology that made sense to him in ways that words on a page never had. Miss Rivera was right. He wasn't stupid. He was just different. And maybe, just maybe, different could be good. Graduation day felt surreal. Daniel stood in his cap and gown, diploma in hand, barely believing he'd made it. Sure, he'd graduated near the bottom of his class, but he'd graduated. That was something nobody had been certain about just a year ago. His parents beamed with pride, taking pictures on their old phone. His mother cried happy tears. For them, having a son graduate from an American high school was a dream come true. They didn't care about his class ranking or his grade point average. He'd finished, and that was enough. But for Daniel, standing there in the parking lot after the ceremony, watching his former classmates celebrate their acceptances to big universities, he felt lost. Everyone seemed to have a plan, a path forward, and he had nothing. Well, not exactly nothing. He had a full-time position at the convenience store if he wanted it. The manager had already offered 40 hours a week at slightly above minimum wage. It was steady work, reliable money. Many people would be grateful for it, but something inside Daniel whispered that there had to be more. A few weeks after graduation, Ms. Rivera called him. She'd gotten his number from the school directory before she left for summer break. "Daniel, I've been thinking about you," she said. "Have you considered going to community college?" He almost laughed. "Ms. Rivera, I barely made it through high school. College isn't for people like me." "Stop that," she said firmly. "College isn't just one thing. Have you looked at the vocational programs at the community college? They have a technical training program for computer and electronics repair. It's hands-on, practical work. I think you'd be amazing at it." Daniel sat on his bed, phone pressed to his ear, processing this idea. He'd never thought about community college as an option. Everyone always talked about college like it meant four-year universities with impossible admission standards and crushing student debt. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I'm working full-time now. My family needs the money." "The program has evening and weekend classes," Ms. Rivera continued. "You could work and study. It won't be easy, but you've never chosen easy anyway." She had a point there. That night, Daniel looked up the community college website. The computer repair program was a 2-year certificate. The classes covered things like hardware diagnostics, software troubleshooting, network basics, and customer service. As he read through the course description, something clicked. This was stuff he could actually see himself doing. More than that, it was stuff he already did, in a way. At the convenience store, customers often asked him to look at their phones or help with basic tech problems. He'd fixed the store's computers twice when they'd crashed. He'd set up the owner's new tablet and taught him how to use it. He was good at this. The application process was straightforward. No essays about his life goals or letters of recommendation, just basic information and a placement test. When Daniel took the placement test, his reading scores were low, but his logic and problem-solving scores were surprisingly high enough to get accepted into the program. The tuition was affordable, especially with financial aid. He could make it work if he kept his job and cut back on everything else. No social life, no going out, no extras. Just work and school and sleep whenever he could fit it in. His parents were uncertain at first. They worried about the cost, about him taking on too much, about whether it would actually lead to anything. But Daniel could see the hope in their eyes too. The possibility that their son might have a real career someday, not just a job. He enrolled for the fall semester, signing up for 2 evening classes. Computer hardware fundamentals and introduction to operating systems. His hands shook a little as he confirmed his registration. This was either going to be the best decision he'd ever made, or another spectacular failure to add to his collection. The first day of class, Daniel walked into the computer lab feeling that familiar anxiety. He was prepared to be the dumbest person in the room, the one who couldn't keep up, the one who asked stupid questions. But something different happened. The instructor, a guy named Tom who'd worked in IT for 15 years before becoming a teacher, started talking about computer components. He held up a motherboard and asked if anyone could identify the parts. Half the class stared blankly. But Daniel raised his hand. "That's the CPU socket, those are the RAM slots, that's the power connector," he said, pointing to each component. Tom grinned. "Someone's done their homework." "What's your name?" "Daniel." "Well, Daniel, you're going to do great in this class." It was such a small moment, but it felt huge. He'd been right about something, known an answer, been praised instead of corrected. As the weeks went on, Daniel discovered something amazing. He wasn't struggling. The material made sense to him in a way that history dates and English grammar rules never had. When Tom demonstrated how to disassemble a computer, Daniel's hands seemed to know what to do before his brain fully processed the instructions. He could look at a circuit board and understand the logic of how electricity flowed through it. His dyslexia still made the textbook reading difficult. He listened to digital audiobooks when available and spent extra time on written assignments. But the hands-on work, the actual doing of the tasks, came naturally. More than naturally, it came easily. For the first time in his educational life, Daniel wasn't just keeping up. He was excelling. His work schedule was brutal. He'd finish his shift at the convenience store at midnight, drive to his apartment, study until 2 or 3 in the morning, sleep for a few hours, then head to his weekend classes. On class nights, he'd go straight from work to school, sitting in the back of the classroom with coffee and determination. The other students started coming to him with questions. How do you troubleshoot a computer that won't boot? Why is this laptop overheating? Can you help me understand how to install this software? Daniel found himself becoming the person others relied on, the expert in the room. It was a completely foreign feeling, and he loved it. One night in his second semester, the instructor brought in a broken laptop that had been donated to the school. This thing is dead, Tom announced. Multiple students and I have tried to fix it. I'm going to leave it here, and if anyone can get it running, there's extra credit in it. Most students glanced at it and went back to their own projects. But Daniel was intrigued. During his break, he pulled the laptop over and started examining it. The power button did nothing. No lights, no sounds, completely dead. He opened it up carefully, checking connections. Everything looked fine at first glance, but then he noticed something odd. A tiny crack in the power jack where the charger plugged in. It was almost invisible, but it was there. The laptop wasn't getting power because the connection was broken. Daniel didn't have the right parts to fix it properly, but he had an idea. Using a small piece of wire and some careful soldering, he bypassed the damaged jack and created a direct connection to the power supply. It was a makeshift solution, definitely not something you'd do for a customer, but it might work for demonstration purposes. He plugged in the charger, held his breath, and pressed the power button. The laptop whirred to life, displaying the startup screen. Around him, other students stopped what they were doing and stared. "No way," someone said. "How did you do that?" Tom came over, examined Daniel's work, and shook his head in amazement. "That's creative problem solving right there. This is exactly the kind of thinking that makes great technicians." Daniel felt 10 feet tall. He'd solved a problem that had stumped everyone else. His brain, the same brain that had failed English tests and couldn't remember history dates, had figured out something complex and practical. That night, walking to his car after class, Daniel thought about how far he'd come. A year ago, he'd been a high school student convinced he was destined for failure. Now he was succeeding in ways he'd never imagined possible. He still had a long way to go. He was exhausted all the time, barely scraping by financially, and his social life was non-existent. But he was moving forward. Learning, growing, becoming someone he could be proud of. As he drove home through the quiet streets, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future he'd never dared to dream about before. A real career, financial stability, maybe even his own business someday. It seemed impossible, but then again, so had graduating from high school once upon a time. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't the student who came last. He was the student who understood that success has many different paths and sometimes the longest. Hardest road leads to the most beautiful destinations. Daniel finished his 2-year certificate program at 21, graduating at the top of his class. The irony wasn't lost on him. The kid who'd ranked last in high school had finished first in his technical program. His parents attended the ceremony, his mother crying even harder than she had at his high school graduation. But a certificate didn't automatically equal a job. Daniel spent weeks sending out resumes to computer repair shops and IT departments around the city. Most never responded. A few sent rejection emails. The ones who did call him back offered wages barely higher than what he was already making at the convenience store. The problem was simple. No experience. Every job wanted 2 years of professional experience, but nobody would give him a chance to get that experience. It was the same frustrating cycle that trapped so many people. After his 10th rejection, Daniel sat in his small apartment feeling defeated. He'd worked so hard, learned so much, and for what? To end up right back where he started, working retail with no future in sight. But then he remembered something his instructor Tom had said during the last week of class. The best opportunities aren't always the ones other people create for you. Sometimes you have to create them yourself. That night, Daniel made a decision that terrified and excited him in equal measure. If nobody would hire him, he'd hire himself. He had $3,000 in savings. It wasn't much, but it was something. He spent $200 registering a business license for tech solutions. Another $300 went to basic tools and supplies, a used toolkit, replacement parts, cleaning materials. He designed a simple flyer on his laptop and printed 500 copies at the local print shop. His business plan was straightforward. He'd offer affordable computer repair services to his neighborhood, targeting regular people who couldn't afford the high prices at big repair shops. House calls, honest pricing, clear explanations of what was wrong and how he'd fix it. The first week, Daniel walked his entire neighborhood, putting flyers in mailboxes and on community bulletin boards. He posted in local social media groups. He told everyone at the convenience store what he was doing. His manager even let him put a small advertisement on the counter. For 3 days, nothing happened. No calls, no messages. Daniel started to think he'd made a terrible mistake, wasted money he couldn't afford to lose. Then his phone rang. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen had gotten his flyer. Her computer wasn't working and she didn't know what to do. She couldn't drive to a repair shop and she didn't understand how to mail it somewhere. Could he come to her house and look at it? Daniel drove to her apartment that evening, nervous but excited. The computer was old, running slowly, full of malware from suspicious websites her grandson had visited. It took him 2 hours to clean it up, update the software, and explain to Mrs. Chen how to avoid getting viruses in the future. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching for her purse. Daniel had planned to charge $50, which was less than half what big shops charged. But looking at Mrs. Chen's small apartment, the way she counted out her bills carefully, he couldn't bring himself to take that much. $40, he said. Her face lit up. "The shop downtown wanted to charge me $200, and they said I'd have to leave it there for a week." She paid him, thanked him profusely, and then did something even better. She called her friend right there and told her about this wonderful young man who fixed computers and didn't charge an arm and a leg. That first customer turned into 2 more that week. Then 5 the next week. Then 8. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Daniel was reliable, affordable, and most importantly, he actually explained things in ways people could understand. He didn't talk down to customers or use confusing technical jargon. He treated everyone with respect, especially the older folks who felt intimidated by technology. Within 3 months, Daniel was getting more calls than he could handle while still working at the convenience store. He was running on 4 hours of sleep, exhausted all the time, but his bank account was growing. He'd made more in those 3 months than he usually made in 6 at his retail job. He took the leap and quit the convenience store to focus on his business full-time. It was scary giving up that steady paycheck, but his repair business was bringing in consistent income now. As his reputation grew, Daniel started getting calls for bigger jobs. Small businesses needed help setting up networks, troubleshooting issues, maintaining their systems. He charged more for business clients, using that extra income to subsidize his lower rates for individual customers in the neighborhood. One of his business clients was a small law firm with 5 employees. Their entire computer system crashed one Monday morning, threatening to derail their whole week. The IT company they usually used couldn't come out for 3 days. Someone remembered the flyer they'd seen for tech solutions and called Daniel in desperation. He arrived within an hour, diagnosed the problem as a failed server hard drive, and had them back up and running by end of business. The senior partner was so impressed that he recommended Daniel to 3 other businesses. By his 2nd year of running tech solutions, Daniel had steady contracts with a dozen small businesses. He'd moved out of his studio apartment into a small office space where customers could drop off computers. He'd bought a used van, painted his business name on the side, and filled it with tools and parts. He'd even hired his first employee, a recent graduate from his old technical program. The money was good. Better than good. He was making more than he'd ever imagined possible. He paid off his community college loans. He bought his parents a new refrigerator when theirs broke and didn't let them pay him back. He started a small savings account for emergencies and future growth. But more than the money, Daniel loved the work. Every day was different. Every problem was a puzzle to solve, and the gratitude from customers who depended on their computers for work, school, or staying connected with family made every long day worth it. One afternoon, a woman brought in her laptop looking panicked. She was a freelance graphic designer, and the laptop had all her client files on it. No backup. The computer wouldn't turn on, and she had a major deadline the next day. Daniel knew that data recovery was expensive. The big companies charged hundreds, sometimes thousands, for this kind of work. He could see the woman was already stressed about money and deadlines. He spent 4 hours carefully extracting the hard drive, connecting it to his recovery equipment, and pulling off every file. He saved her entire business, her livelihood. When she asked how much she owed, tears already forming in relief, he charged her $75. "That's all?" she asked, shocked. "That's all," Daniel confirmed. "I know what it's like to struggle. I'm just glad I could help." She left a glowing review online that brought in 10 new customers. But more than that, she sent him a thank you card a week later. Inside, she'd written, "You saved my business and treated me with kindness when I was at my lowest." That's the kind of person the world needs more of. Daniel kept that card on his desk. On hard days when nothing seemed to work right, when customers were difficult, or when he questioned his decisions, he'd look at that card and remember why he'd started this business in the first place. Not just to make money, though that mattered, but to help people, to solve problems, to build something of his own that reflected his values. By year 3, Daniel had 3 employees and 2 work vans. He'd moved into a bigger office space in a better part of town. He had contracts with over 30 businesses and hundreds of individual customers. Tech Solutions had become a known name in the community. At 25, Daniel hit a milestone he'd never dreamed possible. His business crossed $1 million in annual revenue. After expenses and payroll, he personally took home 6 figures. The kid who'd been told he wasn't college material, who'd worked the night shift at a convenience store just to help his family pay rent, was now a successful business owner. He'd made it. Not through the traditional path everyone had expected. Not by following the rules about 4-year degrees and corporate ladders, but by finding his own way, playing to his strengths, and never giving up even when everyone counted him out. Daniel had gone from being the student who came last to being the entrepreneur who built something meaningful. And he was just getting started. At 32 years old, Daniel pulled into the parking lot of his old high school. His nice car, the result of years of hard work and smart business decisions, felt out of place among the student vehicles. He sat there for a moment, memories flooding back. The failed tests, the shame, the absolute certainty that he'd never amount to anything. He checked his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his tie. Today he was the guest speaker for Career Day. When the invitation had come 3 weeks ago, he'd almost said no. What did he have to say to high school students? But then he remembered being that struggling kid in the back row, and he knew he had to come. The hallways looked the same, but felt different. Or maybe he was different, and that changed how he saw everything. Students rushed past, absorbed in their own dramas and worries, just like he'd been all those years ago. A young teacher met him at the main office and walked him to the auditorium. "The students are really excited," she said. "We don't get many local success stories. Most of our speakers are from big corporations or universities." Daniel smiled but didn't say much. Success story. The label felt strange. In his mind, he was still that kid who barely graduated, still fighting every day to prove he deserved the life he'd built. The auditorium was packed with juniors and seniors. As Daniel walked onto the stage, he scanned the crowd and immediately spotted them. The kids sitting in the back slouched in their seats, looking like they wished they were anywhere else. The ones who'd already been told they weren't good enough, smart enough college material, he'd been one of them. He knew exactly how they felt. The principal gave a brief introduction, listing Daniel's accomplishments. Founded Tech Solutions at 21. Grew it to a multi-million-dollar business with 15 employees and 3 locations. Served over 5,000 customers. Featured in the local business journal as one of the area's top young entrepreneurs. It all sounded impressive. But Daniel knew it didn't tell the real story. He stepped up to the microphone and looked out at all those young faces. Some interested, some bored, some already convinced this didn't apply to them. "Thank you for having me," Daniel began. "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. 13 years ago, I sat in this exact auditorium for my own career day, and I didn't listen to a single word any speaker said. because I was convinced that success stories weren't for people like me. A few students in the back perked up slightly. I graduated from this school ranked near the bottom of my class. I failed more tests than I passed. I had teachers who'd given up on me, classmates who thought I was stupid, and honestly, I thought they were all probably right. He could see the skepticism on some faces. This successful businessman had struggled. Sure, I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Daniel continued. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something crucial. Your grades right now don't define your future. The way you do in traditional school doesn't determine what you're capable of achieving in life. He told them his story, not sugarcoating anything. The dyslexia that went undiagnosed for years, working night shifts at a convenience store while trying to stay awake in class, the shame of being seen as the dumb kid, the fear that he'd never be anything more than a minimum wage worker. But then he told them about Ms. Rivera, about getting diagnosed, about finding a different path through community college, about starting his business with $3,000 and a lot of hope, about the failures along the way, the times he almost quit, the moments when success seemed impossible. Here's what I learned, he said, his voice getting stronger. There are many different kinds of intelligence, many different paths to success. The world will try to fit you into one specific box, one narrow definition of what it means to be smart or successful. But you don't have to fit in that box. He talked about his employees, several of whom had similar stories. Kids who struggled in traditional school but excelled at practical hands-on work. People who'd been written off but found their calling in fields that valued different skills. Some of you will go to four-year universities, and that's great. Some will go to trade schools or community colleges, and that's great too. Some will start businesses, join the military, become artists, or find paths that don't exist yet. All of these are valid. All of these can lead to successful, meaningful lives. A hand went up in the audience. A girl in the middle section. But how do you know which path is right? What if you choose wrong? Daniel smiled. Honest answer? You probably will choose wrong at first. I applied to probably 20 jobs that rejected me before I started my business. And even that worked out more through luck and persistence than perfect planning. The key isn't choosing the perfect path right away. It's being willing to try things, learn from mistakes, and adjust as you go. More hands went up. For the next 30 minutes, Daniel answered questions. How did you learn about business? How did you get customers? Were you scared? What about health insurance and taxes and all the boring adult stuff? He answered honestly, acknowledging what was hard while emphasizing that challenges didn't mean failure. After the formal presentation ended, students were supposed to go back to class. But a line formed of kids wanting to talk to him personally. Daniel stayed, answering every question, listening to every concern. Near the end of the line was a boy who looked about 17. Quiet, nervous, clearly uncomfortable being there. He reminded Daniel so much of his younger self that it was almost painful. Can I ask you something? The boy said quietly when his turn came. Of course. Did you ever feel like everyone was just waiting for you to fail? Like they were all thinking you'd never make it? And they were just being nice by not saying it out loud? Daniel's heart broke a little. He knew that feeling intimately. Every single day, he admitted. For years. And you know what? Some of them probably were thinking that. Some people did expect me to fail. But here's the thing I eventually learned. Their expectations of you don't have to become your expectations of yourself. The boy nodded slowly, processing this. Can I tell you something else? Daniel continued. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to look back at this time and barely recognize that person. The you that exists right now, struggling and doubting yourself, is not the final version. You're still being written. How do I get from here to where you are? The boy asked. One step at a time, Daniel said. Find one thing you're good at, even if it seems small or unimportant. Build on that. Find people who believe in you. When you fail, and you will fail sometimes, get back up. Keep moving forward. He pulled out a business card and wrote his personal cell number on the back. If you ever need advice or you just need someone to tell you that you can do this, call me. The boy took the card like it was something precious. Thank you, he whispered. As Daniel finally left the school that afternoon, he felt different than when he'd arrived. Lighter somehow. He'd spent so many years running from his past, trying to prove he wasn't that failing student anymore. But today he'd embraced it, owned it, used it to hopefully help someone else. A week later, his phone rang from an unknown number. When he answered, a nervous voice said, Mr. Daniel, this is Kevin, from the high school. You said I could call. Daniel smiled. Of course, Kevin. What's going on? They talked for an hour. Kevin had dyslexia too, recently diagnosed. He was failing most of his classes but was great with his hands, loved fixing things. He didn't know what to do after high school and was terrified of the future. Daniel told him about the community college program, offered to be a reference if needed, invited Kevin to come shadow him at work for a day, to see what the job was actually like. That conversation led to others. Kevin started volunteering at Tech Solutions on weekends, learning the business. Daniel hired him part-time when he graduated. Within 2 years, Kevin was one of his best technicians, but Kevin wasn't the only one. Daniel started getting calls and emails from students and parents who'd heard his career day speech. Kids who felt lost, who didn't fit the traditional mold, who needed someone to believe in them. Daniel realized he had an opportunity to make a real difference. Using his business profits, he established a scholarship fund for students with learning disabilities and those facing financial hardships. It wasn't huge, just enough to help a few students each year with tuition for technical programs or community college. He started speaking at other schools, sharing his story, encouraging kids who felt like he once did. He created an internship program at Tech Solutions specifically for students who struggled in traditional academics but showed aptitude for technical work. Every time he hired someone who'd been told they weren't smart enough, every time he gave a kid their first real chance, Daniel felt like he was repaying the debt he owed to Ms. Rivera, the teacher who'd seen potential in him when nobody else did. On his 33rd birthday, Daniel sat in his office after everyone had gone home. On his desk was a photo of himself at 18, wearing his high school graduation gown, looking lost and scared. Next to it was a recent photo from a local business award ceremony, shaking hands with the mayor. Same person, completely different life. He thought about the journey from there to here, all the failures and setbacks, the nights he'd cried from exhaustion and frustration, the times he'd wanted to quit, but also the small victories. The first satisfied customer, the first employee hired, the first time he'd helped someone else find their path. Daniel had learned that success wasn't really about the money in his bank account or the size of his business. It was about the person he'd become along the way. Someone who persevered, someone who lifted others up, someone who proved that the student who came last could still finish, first in the ways that truly mattered. His phone buzzed, with a text from Kevin, a photo of his acceptance letter to a technical certification program, with the caption, "I got in. Thank you for believing in me." Daniel smiled and typed back, "I always knew you would. Now go prove everyone wrong just like I did." He looked out his office window at the city lights. Somewhere out there was another kid like he'd been, struggling, scared, convinced they weren't good enough. Maybe his story would reach them. Maybe it would give them hope. And maybe, just maybe, they'd realize that being last at the start doesn't mean you can't be first at the finish line. Sometimes the longest journey leads to the most beautiful destination. Sometimes the people who struggle the most at the beginning have the strongest foundations for success. Daniel had been that struggling student, and now he was living proof that your story doesn't end where it begins. You get to write the rest of the chapters yourself. And his story, he decided, was far from over.